Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleoconservatism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, we're going to be looking at Sexual Personae by Camille Paglia. This book is fantastic. It's pretty long. It's almost 700 pages long, 670-something, 673. It's a long book, and it's a really good and interesting book. A lot of this is like art history. This was published in 1990, or published in 1991. Copyright 1990. This is Camille Paglia's first book, and it basically traces Western art from ancient Greece through, say, Emily Dickinson, I guess is where it closes out, and she's, I believe, 19th century. So it's quite a bit of material covered. She has another book after this that continues her train of thought into 20th century cinema and art. I haven't read that one. What I found most interesting about this, I mean, the entire book is interesting, especially if you're into art. I like art. This isn't obviously a podcast about art, so there's a significant portion of the book that I'm not going to touch on in this episode. The part of the book that I wanted to talk about is really the beginning. Nothing that I'm going to read from or really discuss is anything outside the first 100 pages, because that is where she introduces the ancient Greeks, and she introduces the idea of Apollo and Dionysus, which we saw in the last episode in Friedrich Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. That interaction between Apollo and Dionysus as Western psychological forces, or just psychological forces in general, but personified as the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus, and the psychological effects of these forces, which could be considered psychological drives or sociological drives or sort of metaphysical principles. That's what I find really interesting, the psychological and political impacts of these forces, if you will. And so in the first 3 chapters is where she talks about that most specifically. Really, the first and third chapter get the most discussion of that. But it is the Apollonian and Dionysian drives are carried throughout the book. And it's largely, well, the subtitle of the book is Art and Decadence, from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson. When she talks about decadence, she's really, it seems to me, talking about like pushing the boundaries of what art is and what art can represent. And when she talks about personae and sexual personae, she's talking about, well, the persona, which is sort of the personality, but it's a personality recognized more as mildly artificial. But in the sense that all personality is sort of mildly artificial, because we sort of build our personalities and we present ourselves to the world in a certain way. We want to be seen in a certain way. And we use our persona and our personality as mechanisms of expressing deeper subconscious or drives, or deeper even like psychosexual components of ourselves that come through in this persona we present to the world, and using art as a way of displaying these other psychological and sociological drives, and even religious drives and things like that. And so it's really interesting. But again, I only want to get into detail in the beginning parts because the Apollonian and Dionysian just really compel me. And what I'm really aiming to do here is to explore the pagan psychology and how that creates a set of morals and a set of political institutions and a way of viewing the world that is different from the Christian psychology and sociology. What is the difference between these two? And again, I see a sort of secular Christianity in much of liberalism and progressivism. It takes, and this is a theme that's been touched on more recently with like the rise of the protest movements, seeing in them a sort of quasi-religious tone. I think that the progressivism takes much of the value system of Christianity and secularizes it, and the pagan system of morals, to me, resembles conservatism in a number of interesting ways. And this is obviously a little different than the way most people conceive of conservatism, but it's something that I see and I think I want to explore further. And it kind of corresponds with some of the things that Nietzsche said, and also when I looked at On Being a Pagan by Alain de Benoit, he talked about some of those things a little bit as well. It's not a concept that's really well developed, but I'm kind of digging through different sources to see if I can find some things that back that up, and this is one of them. And so, following along these Apollonian and Dionysian lines, can we infer some things about human psychology? Can we infer some things about Western civilization and civilizations in general that we can kind of gain through this pagan polytheistic understanding of reality? So, with that said, I'm going to get in, and like all of my episodes, I'm going to read a number of parts of this book. Like I said, nothing I'm going to read is past the first 3 chapters, so past the first 100 pages. That's all the stuff that I want to discuss in this episode. But I'm going to read a few parts here. I've actually got 8 sections I want to read. Some of them longer than others. Hopefully this doesn't become a really long episode. I don't think it will, but I want to read 4 sections, actually, just straight out of Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is fantastic. It sort of serves as a synopsis of her ideas. It is a little bit more polemical than the rest of the book. She gets more into modern politics because it's really sort of an introduction to her ideas. So she touches on feminism and liberalism and modern politics in a number of ways in this first chapter that she doesn't get into in the later chapters. And so I wanted to touch on all of those because it really brings some of these concepts into our modern world and shows how these concepts relate to modern political movements. So the first thing that she talks about is nature and how we perceive nature and how nature really is. And maybe do we as Westerners have an accurate understanding of what nature is, and do we have an accurate portrayal of it in our minds and in our art and in our conversations? So this is what she has to say about that. She says, quote, "Civilized man conceals from himself the extent of his subordination to nature. The grandeur of culture, the consolidation of religion absorb his attention and win his faith. But let nature shrug, and all is in ruin. Fire, flood, tornado, lightning, hurricane, volcano, earthquake, anywhere at any time. Disaster falls upon the good and bad. Civilized life requires a state of illusion. The idea of the ultimate benevolence of nature and God is the most potent of man's survival mechanisms. Without it, a culture would revert to fear and despair. Sexuality and eroticism are the intricate intersection of nature and culture. Feminists grossly oversimplify the problem of sex when they reduce it to a matter of social convention. Readjust society, eliminate sexual inequality, purify sex roles, and happiness and harmony will reign. Here, feminism, like all liberal movements of the last 200 years, is heir to Rousseau. The social contract begins, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Pitting benign romantic nature against corrupt society, Rousseau produced the progressivist strain in 19th century culture, for which social reform was the means to achieve paradise on earth. The bubble of these hopes was burst by the catastrophes of 2 world wars, but Rousseauism was reborn in the post-war generation of the 60s, from which contemporary feminism developed. Rousseau rejects original sin, Christianity's pessimistic view of man born unclean, with a propensity for evil. Rousseau's ideas, derived from Locke, of man's innate goodness, led to social environmentalism, now the dominant ethic of American human services, penal codes, and behaviorist therapies. It assumes that aggression, violence, and crime come from social deprivation, a poor neighborhood, a bad home. Thus, feminism blames rape on pornography, and by a smug circularity of reasoning, interprets outbreaks of sadism as a backlash to itself. But rape and sadism have been evident throughout history, and at some moment in all cultures. This book takes the point of view of Sade, the most unread major writer in Western literature. Sade's work is a comprehensive satiric critique of Rousseau, written in the decade after the first failed Rousseauist experiment, the French Revolution, which ended not in political paradise, but in the hell of the Reign of Terror. Sade follows Hobbes rather than Locke. Aggression comes from nature. It is what Nietzsche is to call the will to power. For Sade, getting back to nature, the romantic imperative that still permeates our culture, from sex counseling to cereal commercials, would be to give free rein to violence and lust. I agree. Society is not the criminal, but the force which keeps crime in check. When social controls weaken, man's innate cruelty bursts forth. The rapist is created not by bad social influences, but by a failure of social conditioning. Feminists, seeking to drive power relations out of sex, have set themselves against nature. Sex is power. Identity is power. In Western culture, there are no non-exploitative relationships. Everyone has killed in order to live. Nature's universal law of creation from destruction operates in mind as in matter. As Freud, Nietzsche's heir, asserts, identity is conflict. Each generation drives its plow over the bones of the dead. Modern liberalism suffers unresolved contradictions. It exalts individualism and freedom, and, on its radical wing, condemns social orders as oppressive. On the other hand, it expects government to provide materially for all, a feat manageable only by an expansion of authority and a swollen bureaucracy. In other words, liberalism defines government as tyrant father, but demands it behave as nurturant mother. Feminism has inherited these contradictions. It sees every hierarchy as repressive, a social fiction. Every negative about woman is a male lie designed to keep her in place. Feminism has exceeded its proper mission of seeking political equality for women and has ended by rejecting contingency, that is, human limitation by nature or fate. Sexual freedom, sexual liberation, a modern delusion. We are hierarchical animals. Sweep one hierarchy away, and another will take its place, perhaps less palatable than the first. There are hierarchies in nature and alternate hierarchies in society. In nature, brute force is the law, a survival of the fittest. In society, there are protections for the weak. Society is our frail barrier against nature. When the prestige of state and religion is low, men are free, but they find freedom intolerable and seek new ways to enslave themselves through drugs or depression. My theory is that whenever sexual freedom is sought or achieved, sadomasochism will not be far behind. Romanticism always turns into decadence. Nature is a hard taskmaster. It is the hammer and the anvil, crushing individuality. Perfect freedom would be to die by earth, air, water, and fire. End quote. So I think that's like the very opening of her first chapter. I only skipped like the first two paragraphs, but she just lays it all out. Nature is brutal, and it is ever present, and society is the structure that we build to hold nature at bay. The liberal idea she mentions in here of Rousseau, the idea that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, this sort of idea that nature is this like benevolent freedom, and that vice in the world, whether it's rape, murder, whatever it may be, comes from social conditions as opposed to being fundamental components of human nature and nature in general. brutality and the war of all against all, if you will, might makes right. These are the laws of nature, and society doesn't create this sort of system. It creates an alternate system to hold nature at bay. Society has hierarchies, but nature has hierarchies as well. And the hierarchies of society are designed to be more fair than the brute might makes right rule of power that exists in raw nature. Society protects the weak. Nature does not protect the weak. Nature eats the weak. And so that is the fundamental misunderstanding of liberalism and of feminism as well, as described by Camille Paglia. So with that said, I'm going to jump ahead to when she, also in the first chapter, when she begins to compare or to identify nature as female. And this is really interesting because the sex roles and the difference between male psychology and female psychology, and male as like the god and the goddess, like a more of a mythological fundamental concept of maleness and femaleness and their identification with social forces, is a really important part of this book. So in this section, she says, quote, "The identification of woman with nature was universal in prehistory. In hunting or agrarian societies dependent upon nature, femaleness was honored as an eminent principle of fertility. As culture progressed, crafts and commerce supplied a concentration of resources, freeing men from the caprices of weather or the handicap of geography. With nature at one remove, femaleness receded in importance. Buddhist cultures retained the ancient meaning of femaleness long after the West renounced them. Male and female, the Chinese yang and yin, are balanced and interpenetrating powers in man and nature to which society is subordinate. This code of passive acceptance has its roots in India, a land of sudden extremes where a monsoon can wipe out 50,000 people overnight. The femaleness of fertility religions is always double-edged. The Indian nature goddess, Kali, is creator and destroyer, granting boons with one set of arms while cutting throats with the other. She is the lady ringed with skulls. The moral ambivalence of the great mother goddess has been conveniently forgotten by those American feminists who have resurrected them. We cannot grasp nature's bare blade without shedding our own blood. Western culture from the start has swerved from femaleness. The last major Western society to worship female powers was Minoan Crete, and significantly that fell and did not rise again. The immediate cause of its collapse, quake, plague, or invasion, is beside the point. The lesson is that cultic femaleness is no guarantee of cultural strength or viability. What did survive, what did vanquish circumstance and stamp its mindset on Europe was Mycenaean warrior culture, descending to us through Homer. The male will to power. Mycenaeans from the south and Dorians from the north would fuse to form Apollonian Athens, from which came the Greco-Roman line of Western history. Both the Apollonian and Judeo-Christian traditions are transcendental, that is, they seek to surmount or transcend nature. Despite Greek culture's contrary Dionysian element, which I will discuss, high classicism was an Apollonian achievement. Judaism, Christianity's parent sect, is the most powerful of protests against nature. The Old Testament asserts that a father god made nature, and that differentiation into objects and gender was after the fact of his maleness. Judeo-Christianity, like Greek worship of the Olympian gods, is a sky cult. It is an advanced stage in the history of religion, which everywhere began as earth cult, veneration of fruitful nature." End quote. So in that section, she begins to introduce the idea that nature is identified as woman and understood as both provider and destroyer, creator and destroyer. And she talks about the Indian nature goddess Kali. Nature is the creator and the destroyer. It is all-powerful in that way. And Western civilization is transcendent, and in the sense that it attempts to transcend nature, she describes it as a sky cult, and nature religions as earth cult. And she basically claims that Greek civilization, Athenian civilization, is fundamentally Apollonian. But as we'll see, it is not in the same way strictly male, in the sense that Judeo-Christian religion is, God the Father. There is no goddess the Mother in Judeo-Christianity. Now, Greek Olympian religion recognizes Hera and recognizes Gaia and recognizes a whole host of female deities that have power. And so it's not exclusively Apollonian or exclusively masculine. It finds a synthesis of masculine and feminine deities, but ultimately places the masculine at the prior position. So I think that is really interesting for its political ramifications, as well as understanding that, in my opinion, a healthy society would find room for these different impulses. Now, I believe, and this is just something this isn't something that Paglia says, but it seems to me that a drive repressed from expressing itself in a healthy way will find a way to express itself in an unhealthy way. I think this is sort of Freudian in a way, perhaps, or Jungian, or whatever, probably Freudian, but that if you have some component of your subconscious mind that isn't able to manifest itself in a healthy way, it will still find a way. And I think that, to me, Christianity introduces a whole new strain of more feminine qualities, such as submissiveness, that isn't as present in Judaism and must find a way into the culture, if not given the avenue of a goddess, will create a way to manifest itself. But that's neither here nor there. It's not a component of this book. Maybe I can find some other books where I can go into that in more detail. But anyway, I think that is really interesting, the kind of conflict between masculine Apollonian culture and previous earth cult, feminine, fertility, goddess-worshipping cultures. So from there, let's see. She also talks about how science itself is an Apollonian function. She says, quote, "Western science is a product of the Apollonian mind. Its hope is that by naming and classification, by the cold light of intellect, archaic night can be pushed back and defeated. Name and person are part of the West's quest for form. The West insists on the discrete identity of objects. To name is to know is to control. I will demonstrate that the West's greatness arises from this delusional certitude. Far Eastern culture has never striven against nature in this way. Compliance, not confrontation, is its rule. Buddhist meditation seeks the unity and harmony of reality. 20th century physics, going full circle back to Heraclitus, postulates that all matter is in motion. In other words, there is no thing, only energy. But this perception has not been imaginatively absorbed, for it cancels the West's intellectual and moral assumptions. The Westerner knows by seeing. Perceptual relations are at the heart of our culture, and they have produced our titanic contributions to art. Walking in nature, we see, identify, name, recognize. This recognition is our apotropion, that is, our warding off of fear. Recognition is ritual cognition, a repetition compulsion. We say that nature is beautiful, but this aesthetic judgment, which not all people have shared, is another defense formation, woefully inadequate for encompassing nature's totality. What is pretty in nature is confined to the thin skin of the globe upon which we huddle. Scratch that skin, and nature's demonic ugliness will erupt. Our focus on the pretty is an Apollonian strategy. The leaves and flowers, the birds, the hills are a patchwork pattern by which we map the known. What the West represses in its view of nature is the Chthonian, which means of the earth, but Earth's bowels, not its surface. Jane Harrison uses the term for pre-Olympian Greek religion, and I adopt it as a substitute for Dionysian, which has become contaminated with vulgar pleasantries. The Dionysian is no picnic. It is the Chthonian realities which Apollo evades, the blind grinding of subterranean force, the long, slow suck, the muck and ooze. It is the dehumanizing brutality of biology and geology, the Darwinian waste and bloodshed, the squalor and rot we must block from consciousness to retain our Apollonian integrity as persons. Western science and aesthetics are attempts to revise this horror into imaginatively palatable form." End quote. So there she's talking about science. She's also talking about art in the sense that to transform nature into something understood as beautiful or pretty or benevolent requires us to repress the more brutal aspects of nature. The Chthonian or Dionysian becomes repressed when the Apollonian takes center stage and redefines things in ways that we can understand, ways that we can relate to and interact with. And I think that's an important way of understanding that it is a form of repression to not recognize that sort of brutal reality of nature. It's a repression that benefits us in the sense that when we devote ourselves to the Apollonian conquering of nature, we're able to individualize ourselves. We're able to form personalities. We're able to separate ourselves and build societies and create rules and all the other things and develop Western science and develop a process of naming and categorizing. And so there's benefit to that, but the repressed will always find a way through. The Dionysian must be recognized or it will disrupt. In my opinion, it will ultimately disrupt our civilization by its demands to be recognized. Okay, so that's all I'm going to look at from Chapter 1. And I've only got one section here that I want to look at from Chapter 2. She talks about Egypt, and she basically describes the Egyptian approach as a unique synthesis of the Apollonian and Dionysian. Now, Egypt didn't recognize the gods Apollo and Dionysus as such, but they did recognize these principles. And they found a way of merging the two that did not discount the Dionysian. It was forced to recognize the Dionysian impulse and built a civilization that integrated it in a healthy way, and the Egyptian civilization lasted for a tremendous amount of time and was very successful for like thousands of years. And she, in some sense, she attributes that to its ability to synthesize the Apollonian and Dionysian impulses into its culture. And I find this really interesting, and I think that perhaps finding this sort of synthesis should be, in some respects, our most pressing goal today, because our inability to synthesize the Apollonian and the Dionysian, I believe, can be traced to a lot of our modern political problems. I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more later on. Let me talk about here what she says about Greece. So she says, quote, "Egyptian culture flourished relatively unchanged for 3,000 years, far longer than Greek culture. Stagnancy, a stultifying lack of individualism, says the humanist, but Egyptian culture lasted because it was stable and complete. It worked. The Apollonian element in Egypt is so pronounced that the idea of classical antiquity should be revised to contain it." Egypt and the ancient Near East were also the source of the Dionysian countercurrent in Greek culture. In Greece, Apollo and Dionysus were at odds, but in Egypt they were reconciled. Egyptian culture was a fusion of the conceptual with the Chthonian, the form-making of consciousness with the shadowy flux of procreative nature. Day and night were equally honored. Here alone in the world were sky cult and earth cult yoked and harmonized. Fertility religion always comes first in history, but as the food problem is solved, nature's moral and aesthetic incoherence gradually becomes apparent. Egypt evolved into the sun worship of sky cult without ever losing its orientation toward the earth. This was because of the Nile, center of the Egyptian economy. Each year the river flooded and receded, leaving a plain of rich black mud. Each year the hard went soft, earth turned liquid. John Reed says alchemy probably began in Egypt since Chem was the ancient name of Egypt, the country of dark soil, the biblical land of Ham. Metamorphosis is the Chthonian magic of shape-shifting Dionysus. The fertile muck was the primeval matrix with which Egyptians came into annual contact. The Apollonian is chaste contour, borderlines. The Nile, transgressing its borders with majestic regularity, was the triumph of Mother Nature. Egypt's ideology of sun and stone rested on Chthonian ooze, the swamp of generation I identify with Dionysus. The oscillations of the Egyptian calendar produced a fruitful duality of point of view, one of the great constructs of Western imagination. Chthonian mysteries are the secret of Egypt's perennial fascination. The gross and barbaric proliferated. A dung beetle, the scarab, was worshipped and worn as a gemstone. The scarab was minister of nature's decay, the bath of dissolution. Egyptian literature was undeveloped because internality was preempted by the death cult. There was only one ethical principle, justice, a public virtue above ground or below. Spirituality was projected into the afterlife. The Book of the Dead was daemonic thought, ruminations, earth-chawings. The mummy, swaddled like an infant, returned to nature's womb for rebirth. The painted tomb was cave art, prayers to demonic darkness. Egyptian culture was both earth-tending and earth-rejecting. Herodotus reports Egyptian men urinated like women. Egyptian gods were incompletely emerged from prehistoric animism. They were monstrous hybrids, half human and half animal, or animal joined to animal. E. A. Wallace Budge says the Egyptians clung to their composite creatures despite the ridicule of foreigners. One god had a serpent head on a leopard body, another a hawk head on the body of a lion and horse, still another was a crocodile with the body of a lion and hippopotamus. Chthonian energy, like the Nile, is overflow and superfetation. The logic and rigor of the Apollonian eye had to defeat Egypt's fuzzy tribal fetishism. The Egyptian synthesis of Chthonian and Apollonian was of enormous consequence for Western tradition. It was in the interplay between earth and sky that idealized form began. Western personality is an Egyptian art object, an exclusive zone of aristocratic privilege. The cartouche, a closed oval, surrounds a hieroglyphic name. In early Egyptian art, a serek, or square palace facade, signified kingship. Cartouche and serek are symbols of hierarchic sequestration, a closing in of the holy and royal to exclude the profane. They are a temenos, the Greek word for the sacred precinct around a temple. The reserved space of the cartouche is analogous to the wedjat, the apotropaic eye of Horus, studying so many amulets and hieroglyphic displays. The Egyptian eye is synonymous with Western personality. Because the soul was thought to reside there, the eye is always shown full face, flounder-like, even when the head is in painted profile. The eye is licensed in Egypt. That is, it is released but ritually bound. The glamorous, black-tailed outline of Egyptian eye makeup is a hieratic accent, both fish and fence. It contains and blocks out. Egypt honored the earth, but also feared it. The pure, clean Apollonian contour of Egyptian art is a defense against Chthonian muck and muddle. Egypt created the distance between eye and object, which is a hallmark of Western philosophy and aesthetics. That distance is a charged force field, a dangerous temenos. Egypt created Apollonian objects out of Chthonian fear. The Western line of Apollonian thing-making, from Homer's bronzed warriors to capitalist cars and cans, begins in the Egyptian caged eye. End quote. So there she's really talking about the two different forces in Egypt. Now with the eye being a representation of sight, of course being more Apollonian, like a thing has to be away from you to see it. In order to see it in its fullness, you can't be up against it. So there's a sort of distance inherent in light and vision and the eye. And so, like, she very much takes the process of vision as being an Apollonian force, as opposed to, say, touch, which is clearly much more of a Dionysian sort of contact and unification. So the Egyptian, the centrality of the eye in Egyptian art and Egyptian religion represents the Apollonian conceptual framework applied to Egypt, whereas the Egyptian gods that fuse animals together and are half man, half human, that sort of represents the maintenance of the Chthonian or Dionysian impulse within Egypt. And she traces this back to the Nile and the process of flooding of the Nile that always demands that this sort of cyclical, watery, earthy ooze of Chthonian nature always remains a vital part of Egyptian civilization. It can never be expelled because of its centrality to Egyptian life. And so because of that, the Egyptians were able to sort of find this interesting balance and actually synthesize the Apollonian and Chthonian into a kind of a harmonic form, which I think is probably, again, to some extent necessary for our modern world to kind of move in that direction in order to become healthy, I believe. So moving on from there, she begins to talk about how the Greeks prioritized Apollo over Dionysus. So she says, quote, "In Egypt, sky cult and earth cult were harmonized, but in Greece there is a split. Greek greatness is Apollonian. The gods live on a peak touching the sky. Olympus and Parnassus are mountain shrines of creative power spurning the earth. In that swerve upward is the sublime conceptualism of Western intellect and art. Egypt gave Greece the pillar and monumental sculpture, which Greece turns from pharaoh to Koros, from divine king to divine boy. Hidden in these gifts lay Egypt's Apollonianism, which Greek artists so splendidly develop. The orderly mathematic of the Doric temple is an orchestration of Egyptian ideas. Phidias brings person and building together on the Acropolis or High City, Athens' magic mountain. Egypt invented clarity of image, the essence of Apollonianism. From Old Kingdom pharaohs to Phidias is 2,000 years, but one step in the history of art. Greek sky cult is an Egyptian colonnade of stony things, the hard, harsh blocks of Western personality. In Judeo-Christianity, man is made in God's image, but in Greek religion, God is made in man's image. The Greek gods have a higher human beauty, their flesh incorruptible yet sensual. Greece, unlike Egypt, never worshipped beast gods. Greek sky cult kept nature in her place. The visibility of the Greek gods is intellectual, symbolizing mind's victory over matter. Art, a glorification of matter, wins its independence in the gods' perfection. We know the name of no artist before signed archaic pottery of 6th century Greece. The artist in Egypt was merely an anonymous artisan, which he became again in Rome and the Middle Ages. Judaism repressed art and the artist, reserving creativity for its fabricator god. The Greek gods, well made but not making, float like golden solids in the air. Jane Harrison calls the Olympians art objects. Their brilliant clarity and glittering chastity of form are Apollonian. In psychology, philosophy, and art, classical Greek imagination sought, in Edward Frankel's words, logos, ratio, the intelligible, determinate, measurable, as opposed to the fantastic, vague, and shapeless. The Apollonian, I said, is the line drawn against nature. For Harrison, the Olympian gods are patriarchal betrayers of earth cult and Mother Nature. The Chthonian is her test of authenticity and spiritual value, but I say there is neither person, thought, thing, nor art in the brutal Chthonian. It was, ironically, the West's Apollonian line that produced the matchless Jane Harrison. Nietzsche calls Apollo the marvelous divine image of the principium individuationis, God of individuation and just boundaries. The Apollonian borderline separates demes, districts, ideas, persons. Western individuation is Apollonian. The Western ego is finite, articulated, visible. Apollo is the integrity and unity of Western personality, a firm, outlined shape of sculptural definitiveness. Apollo lays down the law. W.K.C. Guthrie says Apollo was first and foremost the patron of the legal or statutory aspect of religion. Apollo links society and religion. He is fabricated form. He is exclusion and exclusiveness. I will argue that the Olympians as art objects symbolize social order. Roger Hinks says Olympian religion is essentially a religion of the successful, comfortable, and healthy ruling class. The downtrodden peasant, harnessed by the necessities of keeping body and soul together in a naturally unfruitful land, crippled by debt and social injustice, asked something very different of his gods. The Olympians bore a discouraging resemblance to his oppressors. Aristocracy is aboveness. The Olympians are authoritarian and repressive. What they repress is the monstrous gigantism of Chthonian nature, that murky night world from which society must be reclaimed day by day. End quote. So she's talking there about the prioritization of Apollo in Greek culture and the Greek gods being fundamentally Apollonian and distinct and separate from. There are no beast gods. They're separate from nature. And I think it's interesting that Dionysus is considered the son of Apollo, and yet Dionysus is sort of different from the other Greek gods in that Dionysus leads away from the Olympian or Apollonian separation of deities and separation of form and separation of identity and individualism, and leads the way back to the Great Mother or Gaia, or the dissolution of the ego into a sort of unconscious, naturalistic unification with other entities and with nature. The sort of ecstatic release of the ego is Dionysian. And so I think that's really interesting that one of the Olympians designates a pathway out of the Olympians. So yeah, she talks about how Apollo is the creator of law, the creator of society. He's fabricated form, exclusion, and exclusiveness. I think all that is really interesting. She says aristocracy is aboveness. The Olympians are authoritarian and repressive. And she says what they repress is the monstrous gigantism of Chthonian nature. Now you'll remember that the Olympian gods fought a war against the Titans. They were born from the Titans, and they overthrew the Titans, and they fought a war against the giants. And you might say that both the Titans and the giants represent the lack of self-restraint and extremism and unrestrained life force. It's a different concept than, say, what we see at the Oracle of Delphi of nothing to excess, all things in moderation being the mantra of the Oracle of Delphi. But gigantism and giants and titans, that all expresses extremeness beyond the bounds of reasonable restraint. And so I think that's an interesting bit of the history of the Greek gods right there. So moving on from that is when she gives a bit of a description. Now that we've seen a bit about Apollo, she gives a bit of a description of how Dionysus fits into the Greek pantheon, and a bit about what Dionysus is all about. So Dionysus is often portrayed in art and in myth as being sort of androgynous in a way. He's often pictured wearing women's clothing, and he represents transformation, and so in some ways hermaphroditism is a sort of a Dionysian function. But when she talks about Dionysus wearing women's clothes, there's even, pictures in here of Dionysus portrayed in women's clothing. So she says, quote, about that, she says, quote, Dionysus's transvestism symbolizes his radical identification with mothers. I connect this to his association with water, milk, blood, sap, honey, and wine. The Roman and Renaissance Bacchus is no more than a wine god, but Greek Dionysus rules what Plutarch calls the hygrophysis, wet or liquid nature. Dionysus is, as Farnell puts it, the liquid principle in things. Dionysian liquidity is the invisible sea of organic life, flooding our cells and uniting us to plants and animals. Our bodies are Firenze's primeval ocean, surging and rippling. I interpret Plutarch's hygrophysis as not free-flowing but contained water, fluids which ooze, drip, or hang in tissues or fleshy sacs. The hygrophysis is the mature female body, which I declare a prison of gender. Female experience is submerged in the world of fluids, dramatically demonstrated in menstruation, childbirth, and lactation. Edema, water retention, that female curse, is Dionysus's leaden embrace. Male tumescence is an assertion of the separateness of objects, and erection is architectural, sky-pointing. Female tumescence through blood or water is slow, gravitational, amorphous. In the war for human identity, male tumescence is an instrument, female tumescence an obstruction. The fatty female body is a sponge. At peak menstrual and natal moments, it is locked passively in place, suffering wave after wave of Dionysian power. And then she goes on to say, quote, Dionysus, god of fluids, rules a murky no-man's land of matter half-turned to liquid. Newman notes the linguistic connection in German between mutter, mother, motor, bog, moor, fen, marsh, and mere, or ocean. A Chthonian miasma hangs over woman, like the polluted cloud raining pestilence on Oedipus's Thebes. The miasma is woman's procreative fate, linking her to the primeval. Artemis is woman on the run, breaking out of her cloud into Apollonian sunlight. Artemis's radiance is a militant self-hardening, a refusal of menarche. Dionysus, endorsing woman, also keeps her in the Chthonian swamp. Sartre speaks of the mucoid, or slimy, le vescu, a substance in between two states, a moist and feminine sucking, a liquid seen in a nightmare. Sartre's slime is Dionysus's swamp, the fleshy muck of the generative matrix. There is no vision because there are no eyes. Apollo's solar torch is put out. The heart of creation is blind. In nature's female womb world, there are no objects and no art. Dionysus is the all-embracing totality of mother cult. Nothing disgusts him, since he contains everything that is. Disgust is an Apollonian response, an aesthetic judgment. Disgust always indicates some misalignment toward, or swerving away from, the maternal. Huysmans speaks of the humid horror of woman's unclean body. I will argue that 19th century aestheticism, a vision of a glittering crystalline world, is a flight from the Chthonian swamp into which nature-loving Wordsworth inadvertently led Romanticism. Aestheticism insists on the Apollonian line, separating objects from each other and from nature. Disgust is Apollonian fear at a melting borderline. And then she goes on to say, quote, the Dionysian was trivialized by 60s polemicists who turned it into play and protest. pot on the picket line, sex in the romper room, benign regression. But the great god Dionysus is the barbarism and brutality of Mother Nature. Comparing the Orphic to Olympian strains in Greek religion, Gilbert Murray says, "These things are gods or forms of God, not fabulous immortal men, but things which are, things utterly non-human and non-moral, which bring man bliss or tear his life to shreds without a break in their own serenity. Dionysus liberates by destroying. He is not pleasure, but pleasure-pain, the tormenting bondage of our life in the body. For each gift he exacts a price. Dionysian orgy ended in mutilation and dismemberment. The Maenad's frenzy was bathed in blood. True Dionysian dance is a rupturing extremity of torsion. The harsh, percussive accents of Stravinsky, Martha Graham, and rock music are cosmic concussions upon the human, volleys of pure force. Dionysian nature is cataclysmic. Our bodies are pagan temples, heathen holdouts against Judeo-Christian soul or mind. A modern over-imbiber, kneeling, moaning, and compulsively vomiting, is said to be worshipping at the porcelain god. When the body's Chthonian spasms take over, we are invaded by Dionysus. The uterine contractions of menstruation and childbirth are Dionysus's fist clenching in our bowels. Birth is expulsion, a rocky cascade of spasms, kicking us out in a river of blood. We are skin drums, which nature beats. Invitation to Dionysian dance is a binding contract of enslavement to nature. The violent principle of Dionysian cult is sparagmos, which in Greek means a rending, tearing, mangling, and secondly a convulsion, spasm. The body of the god, or a human or animal substitute, is torn to pieces, which are eaten or scattered like seed. And then she goes on to say, quote, meditating on Apollo and Dionysus, Plutarch says dismemberment is a metaphor for Dionysus's metamorphosis into winds and water, earth and stars, and into the generation of plants and animals. Dionysus, like Proteus, shifts through all forms of being, high to low, human, animal, plant, mineral. None have special status. All are equalized and sacralized in the continuum of natural energy. Dionysus, leveling the great chain of being, respects no hierarchy. End quote. So that was a few sections where she talks about Dionysus, and there are a few important points I think she brings up. One of them is Dionysus as fluid, as hygrophysis, or liquid nature, sort of a fluctuating. So the liquidity here is like a fluctuating, flowing, changing. It's not bound in the sense that it's set in some form. It's perpetually shifting and perpetually in motion. And the other is the sparagmos, or rending, tearing, and that's a sort of destruction. I would say more than like a strict separation, which you could see as more of an Apollonian drive, but like this raw, brutal rending and tearing and gnashing and smashing, which is really more of a fundamentally destructive, so that like everything could just be destroyed, decayed, torn, eaten, shat into just mud and dirt. Like everything, like dirt is just kind of equal, but all sorts of things go into the creation of dirt, but as they're broken down through the process of decay and the process of digestion, that everything just kind of becomes this dirt. Right? So it's broken, everything's broken down and separated in a way, but not separated according to any sort of logical categorization or anything like that, but just annihilated and turned into this uniform substance of dirt, muck, and mud. So it's a blending of all things together, and the elimination of hierarchy and the elimination of separation and equalization and unification of all things into this raw form of dirt and earth. I think that's a good description of the Dionysian aspect within human nature and within the world, within our understanding of the world. And then the last section that I want to read is toward the end of that chapter, when she kind of brings it all home and she provides some She brings it back to politics a little bit, psychology a little bit, and she just gives a kind of a final comparison between Apollo and Dionysus. And so this section here I want to read out. I think it's really clear and can kind of bring this to a close. So in this section, she says, quote, Dionysus is the sympathetic emotion transporting us into other people, other places, other times. Apollo is the hard, cold separatism of Western personality and categorical thought. Dionysus is energy, ecstasy, hysteria, promiscuity, emotionalism, heedless indiscriminateness of idea or practice. Apollo is obsessiveness, voyeurism, idolatry, fascism, frigidity and aggression of the eye, petrification of objects. Human imagination rolls through the world seeking cathexis. Here, there, everywhere it invests itself in perishable things of flesh, silk, marble, and metal, materializations of desire. Words themselves the West makes into objects. Complete harmony is impossible. Our brains are split, and brain is split from body. The quarrel between Apollo and Dionysus is the quarrel between the higher cortex and the older limbic and reptilian brains. Art reflects on and resolves the eternal human dilemma of order versus energy. In the West, Apollo and Dionysus strive for victory. Apollo makes the boundary lines that are civilization, but that lead to convention, constraint, oppression. Dionysus is energy unbound, mad, callous, destructive, wasteful. Apollo is law, history, tradition, the dignity and safety of custom and form. Dionysus is the new, exhilarating but rude, sweeping all away to begin again. Apollo is a tyrant, Dionysus a vandal. Every excess breeds its counter-reaction. So Western culture swings from point to point on its complex cycle, pouring forth its lavish tributes of art, word, and deed. We have littered the world with grandiose achievements. Our story is vast, lurid, and unending. Now, to translate these principles into psychology and politics, Plutarch calls Apollo the one, denying the many and abjuring multiplicity. The Apollonian is aristocratic, monarchist, and reactionary. Volatile, mobile Dionysus is hoi polloi, the many. He is rabble and rubble, both democratic mob rule and the slurry of uncountable objects rumbling through nature. Harrison says, Apollo is the principle of simplicity, unity, and purity. Dionysus of manifold change and metamorphosis. Greek artists, says Plutarch, attribute to Apollo uniformity, orderliness, and unadulterated seriousness, but to Dionysus variability, playfulness, wantonness, and frenzy. Dionysus is a masker and improviser. He is daemonic energy and plural identity. Dodds states he is Lucios the liberator, the god who by very simple means or by other means not so simple enables you for a short time to stop being yourself and thereby set you free. The aim of his cult was ecstasis, which could mean anything from taking you out of yourself to a profound alteration of personality. Ecstasis, standing outside of, is trance-like self-removal, schizoid or shamanistic. Dionysus's amorality cuts both ways. He is god of theater, masked balls, and free love, but also of anarchy, gang rape, and mass murder. Playfulness and criminality are first cousins, flouting the norm. Frosty Apollo has a sculptural coherence and clarity. The Apollonian one, strict, rigid, and contained, is Western personality as work of art, haughty and elegant. Dionysian sparagmos and Dionysian liquidity are analogous. Sparagmos denies the identity of objects. It is nature grinding down and dissolving matter to energy. Ernst Cassirer speaks of the instability and law of metamorphosis of the mythical world, which is at a much more fluid and fluctuating stage than our theoretical world of things and properties. Dionysian fluidity is the plenum of the dank female swamp. Dionysian metamorphoses are the scintillations of nature's high-energy perpetual motion machine. Sparagmos and metamorphosis, sex and violence flood our dream life where objects and persons flicker and merge. Dreams are Dionysian magic in the sensory inflammation of sleep. Sleep is a cavern to which we nightly descend, our bed a musty burrow of primeval hibernation. There we go into trance, drooling and twitching. Dionysus is our body's automatic reflexes and involuntary functions, the serpentine peristalsis of the archaic. Apollo freezes. Dionysus dissolves. Apollo says stop. Dionysus says move. Apollo binds together and battens down against the storm of nature. End quote. So I absolutely love that section. It's so useful just as a really clear comparison. A few of the points she makes right at the end when she says Apollo says stop, Dionysus says move. Now clearly a civilization cannot be just totally stopped or in such absolute motion that it has no stability. And so that's why I kind of think that both of these forces are necessary in civilization, but I also think that Dionysus must be held as the superior of the... Apollo must be held as the superior of the two in order for a civilization to have any sort of stability. I think that to allow Dionysus the superior of the two, one would have a society in a state of perpetual revolution, and nothing would ever be established as any sort of norm or any sort of tradition. Tradition would just be annihilated in the perpetually changing, and it would really be a revert to barbarism. And she says that, she describes Apollo in the following way. She says, Apollo makes the boundary lines that are civilization, but that lead to convention, constraint, and oppression. And then she says that Dionysus is energy unbound, mad, callous, destructive, and wasteful. Apollo is law, history, tradition, the dignity and safety of custom and form. Dionysus is the new, exhilarating but rude, sweeping all away to begin again. Apollo is a tyrant, Dionysus a vandal. So you can't go too far in either direction. This kind of, to me, sort of comes back to the same principle of self-restraint and of the golden mean of Aristotle, of not taking anything too far. And even when we looked at the Greeks by H.D.F. Kiddo, he talked about how the Greeks were obligated to recognize all of the gods, and one person in Greek mythology who worshipped only one of the gods, I believe it was Aphrodite or Artemis, one of the two, worshipped only one of the gods and wouldn't recognize the other god who went unrecognized destroyed that person, and that a person or a society is annihilated by the deity that they fail to recognize. And so a healthy society in that way is somewhat polytheistic in that it recognizes the different drives of humanity. It recognizes the different social forces and how each of them plays a critical role in having a functional society. So I think that's important. I think it can be tied back to what I was saying in the last episode, where the modern political right seems much more interested in advancing the cause of Apollo, and the modern political left seems much more interested in advancing the cause of Dionysus. Could be considered in a way as an Apollonian cult and a Dionysian cult. Now, clearly, neither political side, modern political side, is completely dedicated to one or the other, because it's not even possible to be so completely absorbed by Apollo that you cannot recognize any change whatsoever. It almost becomes pathological to go so far in one or the other direction, so that both sides will recognize some validity of the other in certain circumstances, but seem like they're both somewhat really dedicated to one or the other. Now, I wouldn't say that every single person needs to be dedicated to Apollo first and foremost. You start to lose the capacity to even create art or have reform or change in society, or the very dynamism of society's ability to respond to changing circumstances is eliminated. I think that Apollo should still be held as superior, but that just means that that the quote-unquote cult of Apollo would be more powerful than the quote-unquote cult of Dionysus, or the political right would be in a more powerful position such that it has the responsibility and capacity to maintain civilization, to maintain tradition, and to maintain distinction and the sort of definition and individuation that is necessary for society. And then, there would still, of course, be Dionysian impulses, but the constant battle for supremacy, which is what we see today, this constant battle for supremacy, that needs to end. Someone needs to be in charge. And it seems like the Apollonian drive must be held superior. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I think this is a really interesting book. Like I said, I didn't get into any of the stuff where she gets into Rome and she gets into Shakespeare and she gets into Romanticism. I mean, hundreds of pages of this book get into the various artistic movements and even dives a little bit into the political, but mostly the artistic movements throughout Western civilization and how these Dionysian and Apollonian drives manifest themselves in art. It's all really interesting. I highly recommend the book. And anything by Camille Paglia is always top-notch. So that's all for today. I'll see you next time. Bye.